you. Can I bring in Miriam?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Secretary of State. Yes, I've got a few questions about political impartiality in schools. So earlier this year, the department produced guidance around political impartiality in schools. Now, traditionally, we've thought about that as, teachers shouldn't tell children which party to vote for, which party's policies are correct. But obviously, it's a lot more complicated now, which is why the guidance was produced. So the guidance says, it's important to note that many ongoing ethical debates and topics will constitute a political issue. This can be the case even when the main political parties and other partisan groups agree on a view, but there is not a wider consensus in public opinion. Instead, there is continued debate where different legitimate views are expressed. So in other words, teachers and schools shouldn't be teaching as fact political ideas amongst which there is ongoing debate in the population. Have you had any feedback on this guidance? Is it being adhered to in schools? What have you heard back from the sector?
I haven't actually, so I will be interested I don't know whether you've had any feedback, but I haven't. In my 6 weeks so far, I haven't had any feedback on that issue.
We had some general early feedback from our stakeholder groups that it was helpful. Okay. But not much beyond that.
Okay, thank you. So there is a recent report published by Professor Eric Kaufman in Policy Exchange, based on some YouGov polling, that found that 75% of children had been exposed to critical social justice theories in schools. So by that I mean critical race theory, so the belief that the organising principle of society is racism, gender theory, the idea that there are many genders and everyone has a gender identity. And of those 3/4 of British children who'd encountered those theories in schools, 68% said they'd been taught those ideas as fact without alternative views being on offer, or told that the alternative views were not respectable. Now, do you think that the teaching of those theories, which are highly contested and actually don't have widespread support amongst the mainstream of the population, do you think teaching them as fact is politically partisan?
Yeah, I guess I do think that. Obviously, the guidance was there to basically try and navigate through some of these areas. The most important thing, and I know this is something that you've been campaigning on as well, and I agree with you on, is transparency. People should be able to see what we're teaching children in schools. Parents should be able to see it. Debate it if there is a debate. There's many things there are a legitimate debate about. There's many things that we'll have differences of opinion about. But that ability to be transparent and to have those debates is fundamental. It's fundamental in our schools. It's fundamental in all of our educational institutions. So I think that is where we really need to focus, and we may need to do more. And I know in particular debates, and in particular, gender and biological sex versus gender, and being able to navigate our way through that quite complex area. We are going to update guidance, and we are going to consult, and widely to consult, and I'm sure that we'll get a lot of views and a lot of data and inputs from people who have been looking at this and looking at what's happening in schools. And I know there's a number of parents who are concerned. I get regular updates from parents saying, this. In fact, I had a surgery last week in my own constituency with someone saying, this is something that's happening in my school, and I didn't know about it, and it's having a big impact on my family and her daughter in particular. Yeah,
and I agree. Transparency is really important. It's part of the accountability between schools and parents on these difficult issues, But I think it's wider than that, and there's a reason that indoctrination in schools is illegal, under Section 406, 407 of the Education Act, and that is because in a democratic society, it's very important that schools, who represent the state, don't impose political views on children. And so that's why we have these laws. And of course, there is a difference between a teacher telling a student something and the student encountering that particular point of view in the outside world, because teachers are in loco parentis and they have to believe what the teacher says. They're programmed to do it. We want them to do it. Otherwise, what would be the point of going to school? So what teachers say has particular weight. And I think these findings show that, unfortunately, a huge proportion of our children are being taught as fact theories that the wider population don't adhere to. So what is the department's plan to deal with that? What are the consequences for schools for pushing forward some of these pretty radical extreme views as fact? And I think we need to think about what is the consequence further down the line for the rest of the population if children are being taught these theories that the rest of the population don't accept. So what's the plans to make schools accountable on this?
I think, first of all, the vast majority of teachers would take that responsibility that you describe extremely carefully and absolutely to their heart. And I know you were a teacher yourself. You know, this is a responsibility that people have, not only to debate difficult issues, but actually to encourage debate of difficult issues. And we know that, you know, some of our institutions have lost their way a little bit in this. That's why we've got the Free Speech Act, right, going through at the moment. We know that there are areas where we just need to make sure that we've got this balance right. I don't think we are there yet, and I think there is still part of that journey that we need to go along. But also, I think there are not all settled views. Let's be honest. You know, there are people who have very different views in some of these areas. And we do need to obviously go through that as well very carefully, because, you know, the wider population's settled views, you know, they're not always that wide, and they're not always settled. You know, there is a debate to be had, which is, and in terms of, and I'll let Susan come in, she's probably got much more experience with this, but in terms of, you know, checking what's going on in schools and, you know, things like critical race theory, I know that's been, you know, a concern that the Equalities Minister could particularly, whose area it is really to focus on a lot of this, although obviously we work with her in terms of schools. But it is, you know, it is important that we can have these debates. That we can have these debates very openly.
This is exactly my point.
Yeah.
These aren't settled, they're contested, they're completely legitimate discussions for adults to have. But where a teacher or a school puts forward, promotes one political idea to the exclusion of all others, is that not indoctrination?
I don't know whether they do that.
Well, I don't. Is it indoctrination? No, I mean, this is why our guidance was there, right, to say that that's what you shouldn't do. And as you said, there's laws in place.
How will schools be forced to adhere to?
So I think the question is how much of that is looked at in terms of when Ofsted, because that's the regulation, right? So the regulation is how we're updating our, which we're always updating, I know, in terms of Ofsted, but how they look at these issues and look at what is being taught in terms of the curriculum and making sure that it's reasonable and balanced.
Yeah, and that's certainly something Ofsted take very seriously, and particularly kind of anything with the safeguarding aspect, and also anything that parents raise through the. So Ofsted will always carry out parental surveys, and anything that comes through that, Ofsted will follow up on. Okay. I think the only thing I would add is, I do think we're asking teachers to navigate some really difficult waters. I think what the Secretary of State says about the teachers are working hugely hard to do their best to do that well. And I do think our stance should be one of supporting and helping them to do that. And as I say, the guidance was received quite well. I think it's important that we are standing behind and helping them to navigate some of those conversations well.
Can I just bring in Caroline on that?
Thank you. And I really recognise what you're saying around how sensitive and complex this situation is. And in a related point, I think not just for children who are obviously in this place of learning, but I wanted to share the experience of a number of teachers who've come to me, and they are very concerned at what they're being asked to teach. They don't teach it with authority, they don't teach it with conviction, and in fact they are reporting in that teachers are actively calling in sick to avoid having to deliver curriculum materials that they think actually are quite damaging. Now, I really welcome the commitment to new transparency around curriculum materials for parents, but I think my concern is it for parents to police or to monitor or to judge what is right and healthy and balanced and appropriate in this way, or should this not be considered at a sort of higher level? So in terms of, I have concerns around curriculum and teachers' ability to express their concerns around this. I fear that freedom of speech for teachers is not there, not least for pupils. But I had one additional conversation I wanted to share, and it was just a random canvassing conversation. And a granddad shared with me his utter dismay that his 5-year-old son had come home and said, "Today we were learning if we were in the wrong body." And just to really add to that, he said, "And I wouldn't dare raise this as a concern because otherwise I would be deemed to be transphobic." Now, I understand that there is new guidance coming to help schools in this, but of course, all the while, week by week, term by term, schools are still trying to navigate this terrain. What would be your best advice at this point for teachers and parents who are very concerned at what they fear is being taught in schools?
Well, I think, the point you raise and the granddad and, his grandson, it's not just schools, right? This is a debate that's broader than that in terms of, this side of the debate. I mean, we're all frightened to go on Twitter, right, in terms of, having any views because, we've seen very, very publicly and very high-profile people become targeted because of their views on either side of that debate. And the most important thing is that we retain the ability to have a sensible debate. That's really, really important. As you say, we are putting together guidance in this area, and it will be widely consulted on, because the reality is there are different views and there are opposing views in some ways as well. So, navigating through that complex area, showing compassion, but mostly showing age appropriate as well. I think that's something that, there are some stories that come up, we all hear them from constituents, and I haven't seen it myself, if I'm honest. When I go in schools, I don't know how prevalent this is, but there are certainly some of those examples which are being raised. As Susan said, parents should raise their concerns. Teachers should take their responsibilities very seriously, which I know they do. Most teachers are parents as well. They really do care to navigate through this.
Are we concerned that teachers actually have that freedom of speech in their school settings? Because I think there have been a number of cases where teachers have not, in fact, been supported by their schools.
I personally haven't heard that. I don't know if the department's got any experience of that. I don't find any problem with any freedom of speech from any of the teachers that I mix with as a constituency MP, I must say. I have very, very, and in fact, even, let me just say, slightly even more in this role, because I do have a lot of family members who are teachers as well. So I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't want to see that. So if that is happening, that's something that definitely... no, that's not. It's a difficult subject, but it's not going to be made better.
And then
by
back to Miriam. So, Nick, a quick one, please.
Thank you. I find it extremely concerning when you hear stories that Caroline's just brought in there. I think there's the old saying, "Give me the child by the age of 7, and I'll give you the adult." And I think if we're dropping seeds of doubt into 7 years, into young people, that's extremely dangerous. I think the debate that we talk about, that should be debates between adults. It shouldn't be reflected in school. I think there's books written by activists that are finding their way in school, which there shouldn't be. I don't think parents realise that they have the ability to ask what's being taught. So that transparency piece needs... we need to educate our parents that they have got a right to ask, but not only have they got a right to ask what their child's been taught at school, they've actually got a right to kick back against what they are being taught at school also. So they need to know, A, that they can ask what's being taught, and B, we need to know where they can actually go if they don't get any help from the school, or if they don't get the results that they want in school. And surely, I would just finally on that, if books are making their ways into these schools, what part can your role take in stopping that from happening, or agreeing which books can actually make their way into school?
Well, I mean, parents, it's very important that parents should know what their children are being taught in school. So there's absolutely no doubt, particularly more so when the topic is sensitive. I mean, there was no transgender guidance when we went to school, right? There was no need for transgender, but we have to deal with the world as it is. And the world as it is more complex in some of these factors than when we were at school. But there's clear requirements on schools about providing parents with information about the school's curriculum. We believe that most schools are engaging very actively with parents on this, and proactively, but you know, if it's not always the case, then clearly we need to continue to go in to highlight those areas where we have concerns, and that's part of the process with parents, part of the process with teachers indeed, and part of the Ofsted process. But there's one thing I want to just make clear, because I think there has been, at some point along this journey, which we need to continually improve, I think there was some question about whether schools could show, you know, there was a copyright issue, whether they could show materials. But just to make clear and put on the record, schools can show resources to parents in person without infringing an external provider's copyright in the resource. So wherever it's coming from, they can show that. They should avoid entering into private contracts with commercial providers that seek their right, to restrict their right to show that. So that we've also said, you know, if somebody's asking you to restrict the right to show it, you should very seriously question that. Transparency is really the best answer here. Any child, any parent should be able to see what their child are being taught. And there may be different opinions, by the way, on what's age appropriate. That's the other bit we're going to have to sort of step our way through. But stepping our way through, you know, using a big dose of common sense and you know, a big dose of transparency and listening to parents as well as teachers is clearly what we're going to do.
Very quickly, I want to go back to Miriam on this, but then the other thing I note is that when we had His Majesty's Chief Inspector in her accountability hearing the other day, she did make the point that the words age appropriate bear an enormous amount of weight in this discussion.
Yes.
And that I think when the department considers its guidance, it would be helpful to have some more indications as to what that means. So I think that's something perhaps to take away. But Miriam.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry to press you on this, but it sounds as though the department thinks these are isolated issues. But, you know, the polling, the statistics that this research is based on, if you add the percentages together, around half of British children are reporting being taught these, you know, contested, divisive political theories as fact, with no alternative viewpoint presented, or being told that the alternative views are not respectable. And, you know, these are very destructive ideas that are really attacking liberalism, the foundation of our democracy. And the whole point of not being allowed to indoctrinate children in schools is one of the foundations of our democracy. So, you know, I think this is a much more widespread problem than the department thinks. And I think we're getting confused here between, you know, yes, there are wide debates to be had in society, of course, but what is it appropriate to tell a 5-year-old? No, and I think, you know, and we need to be clear that this new guidance on the transgender issue is based on safeguarding and evidence, and not an attempt to balance contested views amongst children who are not old enough to entertain those ideas.
100%, as I said, you know, there was no need for transgender guidance when we were at school. There is now. That's why we're doing it. So it's clearly addressing a need. I haven't seen the report, but I will look at the report. And to be honest, you know, I'd also look at the polling, I'd look behind the report, I'd look at the evidence there, you know, because there's sides of this debate that have got skin in the game, let's just say. So I will look at that and look at, you know, what level of concern is being raised. We're all the time in schools, most of us are parents and are, you know, very concerned about this issue. But I mean, personally, you know, people have raised issues, but this is not, you know, every school I go into, everyone's outraged with the materials that are being shown. That's not happening. That is not happening. So that, you know, that would give a different view potentially on that. But it was quite a broad question as well. It had many, from what you read out, and as I say, I haven't looked at the details, but it had many different sort of cultural things. It had critical race, it had others, it had quite a lot of things in there,
grouping critical social justice theories
critical,
together.
yes, okay.
Yeah.
So I must say, you know, I'd even have to look at the definition.
We do need to. We have a lot to get through, so we're going to have to.
Okay, do you want to come back to me later on? Then I'll.
Anna.
I'll go.
Just really quickly to underline this issue, I hope. Thank you for confirming that this new guidance will have a safeguarding first approach. Mm-hmm. Can we have your best estimate as to when this guidance will be published? Question number one. And secondly, perhaps one to take away, have you considered the potential consequences of Scotland's proposed Gender Recognition Act going through the Scottish Parliament for English schools?
I mean, obviously they have, it's a devolved issue and they have a different approach. And in fact, there's many differences in curriculum and many other things between our own school and Scotland.
It's more if we've got families going backwards and forwards, if we've got people relocating and we've got a different system in Scotland, it's something which will have to be considered across departments, actually.
Yeah, I think that's probably broader than just this issue in terms of people. The systems are different. The education system's different. University systems are different. You know, there's many different systems. In terms of the guidance, I don't know if there's an absolute date, but I know we will be holding a full public consultation on the draft guidance prior to its publication in 2023. I don't know if you've got any more idea of when.
Yeah, so we expect to bring out the draft for consultation early in 2023, but we think this is one of those things where it's really important that we consult broadly on the draft before we fix on the final guidance.
That's very helpful, but can you, what's the latest that you expect this to be published, just so that we know? This is such an important issue. We do need to, this guidance is clearly critical and needed, so just be very useful to know when that is, the latest date that you would be publishing.
For the draft guidance.
For the draft guidance.
So I'm going to look at the Secretary of State, because we've been doing lots of work on this in the department. I'm acutely conscious that we've got a new set of ministers, that this is a really important issue that everybody wants to look at very carefully. And so, left to myself, I would preserve my ministers a little bit of space to make sure they had time to really look at it and think about it.
Yeah, and I think
if the Secretary of State wants to commit.
I think that's fair, because I haven't seen any of the information yet. I mean, obviously we're asking Minister Gibb is obviously very, very keen to put his slide all over this as well. So maybe we can write to the committee when we've got a little bit more, we've got down this road a little bit further. Obviously we've been in place for 6 weeks now, but we completely understand, or I completely understand the issue, the urgency, the sensitivity, the concern from parents and the concern that some teachers have also raised. We do understand that, which is why obviously we know it's urgent to try and do it. The debate, I suspect, will also be a continual debate as well. These things are the debates for a reason.
One point on clarification, if I may, very quick.
Very quickly, please.
On the guidance. That guidance presumably is around how schools best support those pupils experiencing gender dysphoria. Does it also reflect on the curriculum and that kind of body of knowledge and how that might be delivered in this sphere through RSE, or is that a separate and distinct study?
To be honest, I mean, as I said, I haven't looked at any of it. Minister Gibb probably has missed an intervening period. I don't know if you've got any answer to that, but in terms of describing then what's in the guidance or whatever, was probably not the right thing to do right now. But clearly, we need to make sure that the guidance does what it says on the tin, to make sure. And I think in all of this debate, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that it is sensitive, and there are children at various ages, but largely teenage children as well, who are struggling with their identity, their sexuality, their gender.
In pastoral care and the sort of curriculum.
I'm sure that the whole thing will be looked at and considered in terms of guidance.
Come back to Miriam, and specifically